Hi everyone. Today's lesson is on electrical activity in the heart. So your do now task is to answer those 3 questions, please. So pause the video and answer those. And the answers are coming up on the next slide now. And I'm going to move on, so pause again if you haven't finished that. So today's lesson, we are going to begin by looking at the various parts of the heart involved in conducting electrical activity. And then we will be looking at ECG traces, what a normal one looks like, and also what changes when there's a problem with the heart. So to start with then, how is the contraction of the heart, and therefore the heartbeat, actually controlled? Well, heart muscle is myogenic, and that means that it's able to contract spontaneously. It doesn't actually need a nerve impulse to stimulate it to contract, but the muscle still has to contract in a coordinated way. And the muscle fibers do this through something called the sinoatrial node, or SAN, which is also known as a pacemaker, the atrioventricular node, and the Purkinje tissue, or Purkinje fibers. You sometimes see that written as Perkin. It's normally pronounced Purkinje, and it's often written like that. I think it was, they're named after the man who discovered them, and I think his name was spelt K-Y-N-E, but it was pronounced Purkinje. I think that's why. So you'll see it written both ways, but it means the same thing. So we're going to have a look at the diagram of a heart now. Now this diagram shows you the structure of the heart with some key structures labelled that we'll go through, and then at the bottom we've got the kind of key steps in the heart's contraction summarised for you. So starting at the top then, with the structure marked number 1, that's the sinoatrial node, or SAN. That's the one also known as the pacemaker. Now the SAN generates electrical impulses, and they spread across the walls of the atria. That's the proper plural for atrium. You shouldn't say atriums. And these impulses cause the atria to contract. Those impulses then spread out to structure number 2. Now number 2 is the atrioventricular node, or AVN. And the impulses then travel from that node down through the structure labelled number 3. Now they are the Purkinje fibres. They're basically very specialised nerve cells or neurons. And these fibres kind of branch out into the right and left ventricular walls. So when these impulses reach the walls, they cause the ventricular walls to contract, and that pushes blood up and out through the arteries. So your first task is to produce a storyboard of the process, or diagrams or notes. I don't really mind how you do it, but I want you to have a step-by-step process that you can then try and learn as best as you can. So spend probably about 10 to 15 minutes on this. You can either find a diagram and copy and paste it, or you can draw it out if that helps. Pause the video here so you've got this on the board, on your screen, or by all means go online and just spend 10 to 15 minutes getting your head around that sequence. I'm now going to move on. So We've learned about the parts of the heart involved in conducting the electrical activity. And now we're going to move on to how that electrical activity is represented when we look at ECGs. So this is called an electrocardiogram, or an ECG, or an EKG. You normally see it abbreviated to ECG in this country. Excuse me. So this is an ECG for a normal heart. And we get these by placing electrodes over the heart. And as the electrical activity in the muscle and the muscle activity changes in the heart, we can actually pick those changes up through the electrodes, pass that information to an ECG machine, and then that produces what's known as a trace, which is the graph pattern you can see. You can see really clearly that each heartbeat has a very characteristic wave pattern with different parts represented by letters. And these letters are standardized letters that are used by scientists and medical professionals. So the P to R phase represents the heart relaxing, known as diastole or diastole. And then from the R just until before the T, this is the systole or systole phase, which is the heart contracting. Now, before we look at what the ECG means in more detail, I just want to explain a couple of key terms about the electrical impulses in the heart. So the terms we're going to be looking at are depolarization and repolarization. So later in your A-level, you learn about how electrical impulses in nerves are actually the result of ions, I-O-N-S, ions, moving in nerve tissue. And this is known as depolarization and repolarization. So these terms are basically a more accurate way of describing what's happening in the nerve impulses when muscles contract and relax. So when we talk about depolarization, we're talking about the changes in impulses as and the movement of ions as muscles are contracting. And repolarization is when the ions sort of return into the muscle tissue when the muscle tissue is relaxing. So moving on to what an ECG actually shows us then. So first, the P wave. The P wave represents the depolarization, or the spreading out of the ions and impulses from the SAN, the pacemaker, across the atriums. So this is when the atriums are contracting. That's what you're seeing with the P wave. Next, we've got what's known as the PR interval, and this is representing the time it takes for the impulses from the sinoatrial node to travel via the atrioventricular node and reach the ventricles. And although it's called the PR interval, it's actually measured from the start of the P wave to the start of the QRS complex. Now, the QRS complex is that really tall peak that you can see, and that represents what's happening as the ventricles contract. So that is the ventricular systole phase. Then we've got a T wave. That is the repolarization of the ventricles as the ventricles relax. They're going into diastole or diastole. So the big peak is the contraction of the ventricles, and then the little peak is the relaxation of the ventricles. And that's the relaxation is just as important as the contraction, because if the heart doesn't relax properly, it can't fill up again properly for the next contraction to pump the blood. We also talk about something called the ST segment, and this is the sort of time interval between the depolarization and repolarization of the ventricles. So that's the time it takes to go from the contraction to the relaxation of the ventricles. Now, I would suggest that you pause this video now and spend some time going over that again in your head. It's a lot of information. It might also be helpful to sketch some simplified drawings of the trace. So you've got lots of information on this drawing, and what I would suggest is that you break it down and you draw yourself several copies of the trace, and perhaps on one of them you just label which bit of the traces correspond to systole and diastole. Then maybe on another you could just show the parts of the trace that represent activity in the atriums, and the bits of the trace that atria, sorry, and the bits of the trace that represent activity in the ventricles. And then you could perhaps do another one and just label bits that are showing depolarization and bits that are showing repolarization. You don't have to remember it in quite this much detail, but you do need to remember which bits involve the atriums and the ventricles, excuse me, and which bits involve contraction and relaxation of the heart. Okay, I'm now going to move on, so you need to pause the video now. So we've looked at ECG traces for a normal heart now, and we're going to see what they look like for abnormal hearts. So here we've got a normal ECG trace number 1 compared with others that are indicating health problems with the heart. I want you to, first of all, to just spend a few minutes looking at the other traces and compare them to trace number 1. So for each one, see if you can describe any differences. So the sorts of things you might want to look at are, is the heartbeat regular? Are the gaps between each heartbeat the same? Are the peaks different in size? So is the QRS complex the same, for example, or do the P wave or the T wave look bigger or smaller than in the healthy trace? And an extension to this would be to think about the sorts of problems that might show in the heart. So pause the video now so that you have these on your screen and spend a few minutes doing that task. Okay, I'm going to move on to the sort of potential answers you might have come up with now. So let's start with number 2. So with number 2, you might have noticed that the QRS complex looks completely different from our normal trace. The peak for R is not as high, and when it drops back down, it doesn't drop as low. And in fact, the whole ST sort of section is much higher up than it should be. And that's actually known medically as an elevated ST or ST elevation. And it shows a heart attack is happening. It shows that the ventricle isn't depolarizing and repolarizing properly, which of course will affect its ability to contract and pump blood. So ST elevation indicates a heart attack. Now, in number 3, you might have noticed several things, but from a medical point of view, the most important thing here is that the P wave, the little wave at the start before the QRS complex, is either really small or missing or just not quite right. And that represents something called atrial fibrillation. Okay, so remember, the P wave represents impulses travelling from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node. It's when the atria are contracting. So when you haven't got a P wave, it means the atria aren't contracting and relaxing properly. And in atrial fibrillation, you get almost like a spasm of the atria. And moving on to number 4, well, the R wave is really small, but also the S wave, the trough, is really, really deep. And I wouldn't expect you to know what that represents, but it does actually represent when you've got an increase in the muscle thickness of the heart. So if the heart is having to work harder than it should be, then you will actually get the heart muscle enlarging as it works harder. Okay, so we've now seen how ECG traces help us to identify problems with the heart. We've covered loads of information, lots and lots of new terminology. So I'm not going to move us on to like another topic right now. What I'd like you to do today is simply go back over some of these key terms that we've used, have a look over your storyboard again, have a look at your ECG diagrams. There are some really useful like YouTube videos about ECGs and interpreting them. They are often far more detailed than you actually need, but if you're just interested in a bit more explanation as to how, if any of you are thinking about going into any medical related professions, for example, you might want to just have a little look at that and watch some videos and see how it's done. Okay, thank you.